Hello. Hello, everybody. I have a little thing that I'm going to get situated. Oh, that's so good. Yes, there we are. Hello. Hello, Upward Spiral. So good to have you here. And everyone else who shows up to hang out in this space, whether you make it live or you catch the replay. There's quite a few on the replay crew, it seems. So if you're part of that, say, hey, what's up? Yeah, today is a good day. It's another beautiful day outside. So I'm taking full advantage. And I got a comment yesterday on my Pisces North Node video of how to get the most out of the Taurus North Node transit. And these two questions from the same person, they're so good. And I wanted to use them to just chat a little bit here up top and let people get joined. And then we'll dive into the Saturn retrograde and Aquarius stuff, which I am so stoked to talk about. So these two comments are each a question. I'm going to just talk about one and then the other. So this video that they commented on was about if you have a Pisces or a 12th house North Node and how to use the North. I keep wanting to call it the Taurus Node, the Taurus North Node transit to help you develop your own personal Pisces North Node or 12th house North Node. So this person says, since my North Node is in Virgo in my 12th house, is it opposite for me? And so I wanted to say some things about, hello. Oh, well, sorry you're sick, Shay, but I am glad that you're here. Yay. And Crooked Trail, it never ceases to amaze me that you join like in the middle of the night so that you can be here. That's so good. Okay, so I wanted to say some things about if you have like any placement really where the sign doesn't match the house, and more specifically, it's like the opposite house. Like in this case, typically Virgo is associated with the 6th house as the 6th sign of the zodiac. They have that link. And then Pisces as the 12th sign has that connection to the 12th house. So what if you have it reversed, like a Virgo North Node, but in the 12th house? So that opposite, this person is like, it's so confusing. I agree. It really gets to be like, it's this kind of gray area that makes astrology an art form. That's my own personal opinion. Because when you start getting into the territory of having to combine sign and house, like to do that is a skill set that reminds me of Virgo. Like it takes a long time practicing how to do that combination in order to even like start to understand and make sense. So I want to start by saying, like, if you have this situation in your chart and it confuses you, you're not alone. Like that's pretty much par for the course. So I want to share a couple things that help me to begin to weave it together, keeping in mind that that process of doing the weaving is going to take some time, some sleeps and some dreams and some shower insights and some driving revelations, and like day after day after day we get a little bit clearer on how it works for us, how it's manifesting for us. But one foundation that Stephen Forrest puts a lot in his material is the delineation of like signs versus houses. We are our signs and we do our houses. So signs are motivational and houses are linked with particular activities in our life. And the connection between, like, let's say, in this video that I just put up yesterday, Pisces in the 12th house, like the link. So the motivation is Piscean. The motivation is to merge into the sea of all connectedness. And the 12th house is isolation. And so you think about, like, how do those two things play together? Well, like, they are conducive to each other. Like when you go into isolation, you have a way easier time, like dropping into yourself, reaching some kind of meditative state where you are connecting with an energy outside of you that's bigger than you. So that's how they link together. So you can very much pull them apart. And one of the videos that I have left to do is the Virgo North Node video. So I am excited to do my best to pull apart, like, which parts of these are we talking about relate specifically to a Virgo North Node, and which parts are we talking about that maybe are more related to the 6th house. And so hopefully that helps to, like, weave it all back together for whatever it is in your chart. Um, the other piece that I wanted to say along these same lines is, the nodes in general take us into karmic astrology, and there is the concept, the foundational concept of reincarnation. And my personal opinion is if you have some kind of like an opposite situation going on where it's not just like Pisces in the 12th house, like you got Virgo in the 12th house, like that's right, that's an abnormal combination. In my mind, I take that as like a more advanced version of the lesson. Like there's something that you've already mastered with Pisces. There's something you've already mastered with the 6th house. And now you're putting together like the best of all of it and trying to come up with something that is an individual expression that has never been done before. Like this is a more eccentric, a more abnormal way of doing it, of expressing this energy. So there really isn't a rule book. When you see this combination of where it's opposite, like, there's no rule book. You're going to make it up. And that can be really overwhelming for some people. You just got to like self-soothe, just like take a deep breath. I felt like an instant constrictor in my throat. Like some people want to make it up themselves and some people don't, like it just kind of is part of who you are. And I think that's where it's really interesting that we're going to talk about Saturn and Aquarius today, because I feel like so much of this is part of that. But so those are my thoughts on like what if it's reversed. And I didn't really get specifically into like the Virgo pieces and the 12th house pieces. Like the Virgo video is coming. The 12th house video is available as of yesterday, along with the Pisces pieces. The next one that I'm going to do is the Cancer 4th house North Node video. And that one, especially, um, when you read Jan Spiller's book, which was where I started, she lumps it together as far as like, in this case, a Capricorn South Node and a 10th house South Node, and she describes them in one go. And I feel like you can get a ton out of that. There's so much to consider and contemplate, and definitely as a starting point, I love the universe for putting me there and starting me there. And then give it a couple of months and I get the book Yesterday's Sky by Stephen Forrest, where he also is interpreting the nodes and all kinds of different practices to do with the nodes. And he, however, uses the belief in his practice that basically he has unzipped the signs from the houses. They are not the same thing, and a Capricorn South Node is not the same thing as a 10th house South Node. So that differentiation makes a lot of sense to me based on other pieces that I had been learning over these last few months. So again, it's like I really am going to try with these remaining videos to take it apart so that it's clear, like which parts really relate to the house and which parts relate more to the sign. All that being said, I mean, I feel like, again, Jan Spiller's work is not wrong because there is so much you can get out of it, even with it all lumped together. Oh, thank you. Ooh, thanks, Maddie. Yes, Yesterday's Sky. It's like reincarnation and astrology, I think is the subtitle. And yeah. Let's see here. That's good. If you think of the planet as an actor, the sign as the role, then the house is the setting. I'm going to think on that. If you think of the planet as an actor, the sign as the role, then the house is the setting. Yeah, I'm gonna take that in, play with it, see what I come up with. So this one says, I am Pisces South Node, Virgo North Node, and he is Pisces North Node, Virgo South Node, and here I am. I find that a lot. Like I am the Pisces North Node and I attract a lot of Virgo North nodes out of both the generations around mine, as in like, some of them are like 25 and some of them are like early 40s. Like the last time it happened, my life coach was actually a Virgo North node. And I'm a Pisces South or Pisces North node. So I feel like there is such a a relationship like this, like a back and forth of like such a rich opportunity to like learn from each other. Like you both have what the other is developing. So like you're basically each other's teacher if you want to choose to see it like that. Like it's kind of weird because that also means that like you're 18 and a half years between these north node cycles. So if you are, with a partner or a friend or whatever that is from the opposite cycle, that means that they're like 9 years roughly different in age. So there's a significant age difference. So it's kind of interesting, like the older Virgo north nodes that I've met. Um, I definitely put them on a pedestal, and it was like a whole thing to, like, take them off the pedestal and realize that actually, like, we really are more equals, like, relationships didn't really, stand that development. But the younger Virgo North nodes, like, we seem to be more, like, on a equal footing, like, "Here, I have this, and, oh, you think that's cool, and you have this, and I think that's really cool," and it's such, like, an exchange, so maybe that's more a reflection of me and, like, my ego healing that I've been through, but, yeah, that relationship with the opposite configuration, I think there's a ton of potential growth in that. So, same person saying, "First time I'm seeing the new hair, love it. Mine has went in reverse, used to wear a pixie and now have grown it back out." So, my partner, Dolly, she lived with, like, really short hair for a couple years, and over the last, like, 9 months, she's been growing it out, and she has, like, really curly, like, so much hair, so much thick hair, and so it's just, like, out of control all over the place, like, floofs. And so that's one of the episodes of Heart to Heart that I really want to record with her is talking specifically about hair, like a deep dive into hair and how much of a thing it is. Like it's so wild. So yeah, I'm sure already I'm planning my next cut, like the little adjustments that I want to make, like when she cuts it again. Um, Keeping a lot of it and kind of tweaking it now that I'm living with it and it's settling in. And I'll probably keep it short for a while, and then I'll go on the journey of growing it back out, and that's, like, a whole thing. So, yeah, hair, man, it's, like, super interesting. Okay, so for example, Mars might be one who plays action heroes. If he's in Aries, he's playing to his strengths, but if the setting is the 4th house, most of the action is taking place at home. Yes. Cool. Appreciate the example. Yeah. I always have to, like, go back to I don't know if this is how everybody else does astrology, but I always have to take new ideas and new theories that I hear out in the world. I take it back to my chart and, like, my resonance with my chart and how I've understood it so far, and I, like, put new beliefs into, like, the existing framework and see what happens, Like, maybe my framework is missing something. Maybe the new theory, it doesn't fit for me. Maybe it works for you and it doesn't work for me to understand it that way. Like, you just never know until you take it and, like, run it through your system. Um, and then oh, that's okay. No worries at all. The second question is about cusps, and I love cusps because they are one of the most debated topics in astrology, and I just it's so funny that I'm, like, really drawn to the controversial subjects where people are like, cusps are a thing, and no, they're not. And like everybody is like so definitive and so sure of their way. And I like to get right in the middle of all of it and, have like a completely different perspective from everybody else. So this question says, I'm in the cusp of Virgo. I'm literally the last day of Leo and tend to lead that way. So I'm unsure how to incorporate more Virgo-ness into my life to balance the South Node shadows. This is so confusing. So this is the same person that says they have the North Node in Virgo, so in the 12th house, and that's why they're wanting to learn how to incorporate more Virgo into their life to balance out their Pisces South Node shadows. So that specific part of the question, I am going to refer to the video for the Virgo North Node, which is still in the works and will be coming to the channel soon. But I do want to talk a little bit about cusps and just in general, my 2 cents worth on how I understand and interpret cusps in astrology. So, I guess this is one of those where like you could start anywhere, really. So how do you break into this coconut? Um, Short answer is I do subscribe to cusps as far as like when you get into the territory of a couple degrees of this end of this sign and the first degree or two of this new sign, when you get into that territory, you are in an in between. And that's real. I personally think that, and I can go into as much depth as you want about why, but I think it's real. And so that is one thing that is kind of like the first layer of foundation. And then the second layer of foundation is, but I also think that it is absolutely more the sign that it fell in. Like you're at 28, 29 degrees of Leo is on purpose. 29 degrees even is what is called an anaretic degree and is like a completion point with that sign. So to have your sun at the very end of one of the signs, you are here to reach for an embodiment of the highest possible frequency expression of that energy. And when you do that, there's a natural progression that exists between signs 1 through 12. So when you move from Leo to Virgo, you are making an evolutionary step. As far as like once you've embodied that highest frequency of Leo in this example, and you're moving on into evolving into Virgo, like there's a real progression. It's not just like cut and dry, like Leo's over and now it's Virgo. Like they really do build on each other. So in what was I going to say? Oh, the other piece of like as far as why I believe they're real is like when you look at human design and you see the way that Ra Uruhu, which is the voice that he channeled, that created human design, when that energy came through and laid the 64 hexagrams of the Rave I Ching onto the natal chart wheel, the the hexagrams are tilted such that when you get to the last couple degrees of one sign and on into the next sign, you have the same gate. So you got that gate activated, whether you were at 29 degrees Gemini or at 0 degrees of Cancer. It's the same energy as far as human design is concerned. So that is really interesting, I think, as far as like you really do enter a point of like handing off from the end of this energy to the beginning of the next energy, but it's really not as like this, it's more interconnected like that. So when you get into those gates in the in between the signs, like that's what you have as far as the energy. It is absolutely woven together between both of them. Another piece I want to say about a 29 degrees sun is, or any sun that is like really, really, really late in its sign, is when you step into the world of progressions and looking at progressions on your chart, the sun is progressing 1 degree per year that you're alive, just under 1 degree a year. And when we say progressing, it's basically like your natal chart is a snapshot of the energy that was present when you were born, AKA, like that's what got imprinted on your soul, that's what you brought with you. And then the progressions and their various speeds are aiming to show like how is that initial energy maturing over the course of your life incarnation in this time. And so, like, for example, my son is at like the late part of the 28th degree of Gemini. So before I was 2 years old, basically, my son was progressed on into Cancer. And then you spend 30 years with that progressed son. And just last year, my son finally progressed on into Leo. So now I'm into this 30-year chapter of my evolution. So back to this idea where they have a late Leo sun, that means that in early life, actually their sun progressed into Virgo. And for 30 years or however old the person is, like they have actually been building Virgo talents. And that I think is so common with the North Node is that it's usually in there, but it's so hidden. It's so foreign that we don't even recognize it. So that's what I love about these North Node videos, this series where I'm talking through each one, is like often it's just a matter of like recognizing that you're already doing it, like giving yourself more credit as far as like that's already happening. Like sure you could do it better, sure there could be more, always there will always want to be more expansion. That's the whole point of like why the universe is eternal. But where we are is like usually farther along than we're giving ourselves credit for. So that's kind of my answer on the how would you incorporate more of Virgo in this case. Um, but also just cusps in general. Like, for example, my Chiron is, this is like so interesting. I tracked it back to like, how precise was my energy? Like how closely did I have to land onto this particular bullseye? And I think for one, our rising sign is like specific down to a couple minutes. Like, I mean, especially where I'm a 0 degrees Taurus rising, like it would have taken just a couple minutes to be back into the Aries side. So there's that. But also, Chiron in my chart is at 29 degrees, 47 minutes of Gemini. The next day after I was born, Chiron moved into Cancer, and it had already been into Cancer and had retrograded back into Gemini, and I had just caught the tail end of it being back in Gemini, recovering the degrees that it had already covered on its retrograde. And so that was my energy. And so it's like I very much resonate with the cusp of Cancer, always have. But when you look at the natal chart, as far as like my son progressed into Cancer when I was very young. This Chiron has also progressed into Cancer a long time ago. Um, there's there's a lot of reasons that end up making a lot of sense as far as like why the one sign, as you like claim the highest frequency of it, like does naturally lead into the next sign. I feel like I could do like a whole series of like how does Aries lead into Taurus? How does Taurus lead into Gemini? That would be really fun. Uh, oh my goodness, you guys are all up in the chat today. I love it. I'm gonna have to check that out later. So, okay, I think that's really good. I'm glad to have this opportunity to answer those couple of questions because there's no way I could write a comment with all of that. So, yeah, I basically told this person like, "Hey, check out the live stream. I'm gonna answer your questions." So, I'm gonna do that. If there are questions, fun ones to bring in as far as like super general, like applies across the board to most of us kind of things, to start off these live streams with that. Or sometimes I just feel like rambling. So, we'll just go with the flow. So, today we are diving into Saturn in Aquarius, and specifically its retrograde. Saturn goes retrograde for like 5 months a year. So, and then when you take its shadow into account, it's like really only ever, like, out of shadow for, like, a month each year, so it's actually, like, really, really rare to have a Saturn that's, like, totally direct and not in shadow, which I just think that that's interesting when we get into what Saturn retrograde means in your birth chart. Keep in mind, like, almost half of people are born with this placement of having their birth happen during Saturn retrograde. I also got asked recently the question, how can I tell which planets are retrograde in my chart? And I do want to make a little tiny video for this just to show you the essentially when you pull your chart, there is typically a table of all of the planets that shows you the degrees and the signs and where it was when you were born. And on astro.com, which is the site I use, there's a little R or sometimes an RX next to any of the planets that were retrograde at the time of your birth. And that does something to how that energy functions in your system. Basically, it's like your Saturn energy, in this case, if you were born during retrograde, like your Saturn energy is retrograded. And so it's like your entire life takes on the connotation of Saturn retrograde, which I think is really cool. Um, I have 6, I think, retrograde planets in my birth chart, and learning about that was very empowering as far as understanding, like, why my energies seem to be so different from so many people around me. Like, when I go out in the physical world and I'm with just your random sampling of average humans, I that's why I thought I was an alien. Still kinda do, I mean, but in a much broader context. But, yeah, I mean, I felt very alienated inside of society. I mean, now it's nice because you can go online and put yourself out there, like, wave your little freak flag around, and people who are weird like you, they come over and they wanna hang out, so that's, like, really cool. But retrograde planets, like, it says a lot about essentially, if you listen to Tom Jacobs' video, which I highly recommend, it's him going through his evolutionary astrology interpretation of each of the individual retrograde planets, like if you were to have this in your birth chart. And his overarching theory or approach is that when you have a retrograde planet, it's like you you aren't gonna continue anybody else's path, like, you will be inventing your own path. So, I think it's really interesting that, again, his overarching takeaway from that then, or, like, kind of his summary of how that manifests in your early life is, like, let's say you have Saturn retrograde in your chart, and in general, that means that, like, your work in the world, like, you finding your worthy work of, like, what are you gonna build every single day of your life for the rest of the time that you're alive just because it's that important to you, Saturn, what is that? Like, what is worthy of your time and energy and presence in this physical reality? Um, It's like, if you have Saturn retrograde, you're gonna decide that all by yourself, and chances are you're gonna be born into a family or into an environment or a culture that has strict rules and expectations for what your work on this planet will be. And a good example is, like, if you wanted to be an entrepreneur yourself and you're born into a family where your dad is an entrepreneur and expects to hand down the business to you, and you have to go through a point of deciding, like, do you wanna take on this business from your family and keep it going and keep that tradition alive? Or Saturn retrograde, do you need to break away and start your own business, create your own foundation that is more a reflection of you? Another example is like Indian culture, not to pick on them because I think there's a lot of cultures where parents still have a lot of power over what their kids do. And so often, like, the parent expects that you're gonna go to medical school, you're gonna go to pharmacy school, you're gonna go to law school or engineering school. Like, there are very few options available as far as, like, what is an acceptable course for you finding your path of work in this life. And so if you have Saturn retrograde, a good chance that, like, your parents had a really strong idea of, like, what it was that you needed to be doing, or that maybe you at least perceived that they did. Whether they actually did or not is kind of beside the point. With Saturn retrograde, you perceived that there was a box around, like, who you were allowed to be, and same with Uranus retrograde, like, that's our path to individuality, so you had a box around who your individual self was allowed to be. Neptune retrograde, like, you had a box around what your path to spirituality was allowed to be. These are the things that you get born into so that you have something to help you see clearly that that is not who I am. That doesn't work for me. And because it's rubbing me the wrong way, it's all up close to me and agitating me, I can see so clearly that there is a different path for me. This doesn't feel right. It's itchy and it's a headache and it's a burden and it's heavy and it's hard and it's miserable. And it's like, it doesn't feel right because it isn't right. And so those retrograde planets, it's like you have to do it your own way or you're never going to find like your soul's true satisfaction. So that's the Tom Jacobs video. Again, highly recommend. Thank you, Maddie, for putting it in there. Um, so Saturn retrograde in Aquarius, I have some questions to start off with as far as um, like, actually, this one is the one I wanted to start with. I'm really feeling this. What new responsibilities are you feeling called to take within your life? And which responsibilities are you being called to release? So, Saturn is a lot to do with responsibility and maturation. And there's this like mantra that has been like looping in my awareness lately. Responsibility is a choice. Responsibility is a choice. Responsibility is a choice. None of us are shouldered with any responsibility. No one outside of us can ever assign responsibility to us. Taking responsibility is a choice. And Saturn retrograde feels like taking responsibility for the things that are your responsibility and releasing responsibility for the things that truly are none of your business. So there's like two different shifts happening here as far as like the things that are truly your responsibility. Like what are those in this life? Like your own survival is one of them. If you have small dependent children, their survival is one of them. Um, your approach to life, your general attitude, the way you spend your time on a daily basis, like these, I would say, are the way I look at my own responsibilities. And beyond that, I am, a recovering recovering lots of things, but this is definitely one of them where I am actively bringing my awareness to anytime I feel burdened or I feel taken advantage of or like I'm always giving and I don't get enough in return or like any of these kinds of feelings that in the past like were common and frequent in my experience. It's like now I have tried to learn to recognize those as signs that I'm giving in order to prove my value, basically, instead of giving because it feels good. And so this is like what can you take responsibility for? And I can take responsibility for how how well I take care of myself, and I can take responsibility for what my inner child is asking for in her healing journey. Um, I can take responsibility for the people that I let into my physical and virtual experience. I am responsible for any information that I digest on a daily basis. Um, these are the things that I am 100% responsible for, and I take that very seriously. But there are often things that we are also taking responsibility for that really are none of our business, like other people's emotions. Like, I accidentally said something a few days ago that triggered Dolly. And in the moment, I just knew instantly, like, fuck, like I triggered her just now. And I clearly did not mean to. I never mean to. But I said exactly the right thing. And she like shut down in an instant. And it was so fascinating how I one, like, I felt like I was almost instantly the observer of the whole thing playing out, and my knee-jerk reaction was guilt. I felt so bad for triggering this negative emotion inside of her that I was feeling, like, I was empathically soaking it up as she was emanating it, and it was like, her pain was turning into my pain, and, like, I felt bad. I felt so bad that I had done that to her, and it was like in the aftermath of, like, being the observer through that whole thing, it's like, I'm not responsible for the way that she processes and reacts to what pops out of my mouth, the same as, like, nobody else is responsible for the way that I get triggered, right? Like, I'm responsible for managing my emotions, and I am not responsible for managing anybody else's. I do consider myself responsible for teaching the valuable things that I have learned, sharing that with anybody who's wanting to listen. I consider myself responsible for sharing and passing that along and paying it forward. I am not responsible for how people learn from what I say and what they take from it and what they hear and what they understand and what they perceive, and, like, none of that's my responsibility. This has been especially impactful for anybody who has, placements in the fixed signs. So the fixed signs are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And so this Saturn retrograde is obviously happening in Aquarius. So it's making oppositions with Leo placements, and it's making squares to Taurus and Scorpio placements. And so my it's very interesting that I'm talking about, like, feedback from others and my creativity and, like, all of that. So my moon is in Leo at 24 degrees, so Saturn is stationing retrograde at 25, so it's basically sitting still in a near perfect opposition with my moon in Leo, and it is crazy how it is, like, literally painting this energetic boundary around what is my responsibility and what is not. And anything that is not my responsibility exists outside my sphere of awareness, period. And I take my responsibilities inside my sphere of awareness very seriously. Also, so the fixed signs are getting like definitely like a jolt. Like fixed signs don't really care for change. Like they don't usually approach a situation hoping to get to change something. That's just not in their nature. And so they really don't change until something comes along and gives them a nice, excuse me, energetic shove. And Saturn stationing retrograde and then direct later, here in 4 or 5 months, um, at 15 degrees of Aquarius, no, 18, starts at 25, retrogrades back to 18. Um, that this, like both of those stations on 25 and on 18 are both going to be energetic shoves forward for the fixed sign placements. The air signs, on the other hand, and the fire signs for that matter, are getting the air signs are getting trines, from this Saturn. So, like, it's going from 25, Aquarius, which is basically trining, like, my sun in Gemini, and then it's going back to 18, which is exactly where my Venus is, so that's gonna get a nice trine. Um, Libra is also getting trines. Sagittarius gets a sextile from Aquarius. So like Saturn at 25 or at the end of Aquarius is sextiling my Saturn at the end of Sagittarius. And then it's also sextiling the end of Aries. And then because Leo is part of the fixed sign family, it's creating an opposition, which goes back to the more challenging aspects side of it. So it is fun to think about, especially with longer transits like a 5-month Saturn retrograde. It's fun to think about like how is this activating your energy? You know, that Saturn is lighting up a whole lot of things that's going on like already in your evolution. If you have listened to my Norris Torth node. Why can I not get that out of my brain? The Taurus North Node video. I talk about how, like, yes, the North Node is currently transiting through Taurus, like, for the collective consciousness. It's this collective invitation towards building up our Taurus skill set within ourselves individually, and as we build it individually, it winds up permeating the mass consciousness vibration. So that's happening for everybody, and yet that Taurus North Node is helping each one of us individually to actually step into our personal North Node by sign, by house, and by aspects. So even if it's not talking at all by transit to the Taurus North Node, like there is, it's like building our Taurus skill set ultimately is helping to further our personal North Node soul mission. And same for any of the planets, I would say. I think this is part of my personal perspective and approach to any of these cycles that are going on. Like when I look at Saturn and Aquarius, I think this is a collective invitation that we are all being asked to step into this particular energy and go through this phase of evolution of Saturn moving through Aquarius, and that the lessons and the evolutions from this Saturn and Aquarius chapter are for each of us individually to get to step more fully into our own Saturn. That was a long way around. But so where is your Saturn? What sign is it in? What house is it in? Is it making any significant aspects in your chart? Like, for example, my Saturn is right there with my Uranus. They are exactly conjunct, and they are exactly opposite my Sun conjunct Chiron. So that those four things are like tied inextricably into one piece of energy. So when I go to understand my Saturn, I have to understand like all four of those plus some other stuff that it's doing in my chart. So this is a good time to like step into your Saturn, like your unique Saturn. With that, I also think it's really fun that I got inspired a couple months ago to make a Saturn Returns story time. I watched a podcast episode from the Astrology podcast. If you remember, I got really into their channel a while back and was consuming tons. And one of the things that I watched was a few different people discussing their unique stories from the Saturn return in Sagittarius, which would be my generation. And it really got me thinking about like, what about mine? Like, what was mine like? And that prompted me to go back through, like, and make a timeline. To make that timeline, I went back through pictures, I went back through journals, I went back through emails, I dug back through my archives to try to figure out, like, what happened and when, and so I had it timed, like, down to the day and got some really cool moments of reflection on my own Saturn process, and that just, like, came to fruition, like, became physical and crossed the finish line into physical, just a few days ago. So that feels really timely with now Saturn turning retrograde, on June 4th through October 23rd, and kind of prompting us all to step into our Saturn energy. So to that end, I will be taking that longer Saturn return story time. It's like an hour and 40 minutes, taking it and chopping it down into clips that will air every Sunday. So starting this Sunday, those clips will air for the next couple months to help us step into the Saturn energy that is kind of prominent in the skies at this time. For some of us more than others, depending, like I said, on the rest of your chart. But this is this is a really interesting period that we're almost to the end of. Like Saturn moves into Pisces in March of 2023, so less than a year away with that. And so this is the last retrograde that Saturn will make before it moves on into Pisces. And Saturn is the ancient ruler of both Aquarius and Capricorn. So that means that we have had Saturn in a Saturn ruled sign since Saturn first entered Capricorn December 20th of 2017. And then it was there in Capricorn through March 22nd of 2022, and then stepped back for another period from July to December of 2020. So that means that Saturn has been in Aquarius March of 2020 through July 1st of 2020, and then its larger transit December of 2020 through March of 2023. So this is like a long period, like December of 2017 through March of 2023, essentially. Saturn in a Saturn ruled sign. And that is really interesting. So, like, when we think about Saturn in Aquarius, I feel like you really can't fully analyze that transit if you don't also go back to Saturn in Capricorn, and like the difference between these two energies is really interesting. Back to the series of like, how does Capricorn lead into Aquarius? Saturn essentially represents like the rules, the established traditions, the structures, the expectations of like, this is the way it is. And especially if you have Saturn retrograde, like you're being born into a place where they are going to tell you who you are, and you are going to have to tell them, no, I'm not. And this is who I am, and like go off on your own path. But Saturn in Capricorn is about creating rules and structures and status quo type versions of systems that can stand up to the test of time, that can serve a massive population, that, it's like the difference between inventing electricity and installing the power grid that lets electricity become something that it just exists in almost every home in this country, at least. um, Capricorn is that structure of like, how do we deliver these things to everybody? And so there's absolutely value in Capricornian structure, and Saturn on that side of the coin is very much like build, 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 build. Like, never let up, build it bigger. Like, just it's intense in terms of the amount of structure that Saturn and Capricorn wants to create. And if you see, like, that was very much like the first 10 days or so of the pandemic, as far as it unfolding in the US, that is, um, was still while Saturn was in Capricorn. And then there was another phase where Saturn stepped back into Capricorn. And so the lockdown measures, the restrictions, the clamping down hard happened like right there when it first took off, that really like stayed in effect for a good long while. Um, that Saturn in Capricorn likes that, like, is really more comfortable with that level of structure. And then you get Saturn into Aquarius, and it is like the relationship between rules and the rule breaker. And it's like you can't be a rule breaker if there are no rules. So this is the relationship between Saturn and Aquarius, essentially, is like, Saturn and Capricorn builds the structures that are supposed to serve mass consciousness, mass population. And then you get Saturn into Aquarius, where we reconnect back into our individuality, and we bump up against structures that were intended to serve mass consciousness. And they help us see how this actually isn't right for me, that I am more like this. And because those structures are in place, because the rules exist, the rule breaker, AKA the individual, um, they are able to better understand themselves, because they have this mirror of structure to look into. And by understanding how I don't fit into this structure, that's actually really clarifying about, okay, so then who are you? And that's where the Aquarius piece of it comes in. So my other couple things. So this takeaway is like, your sovereign space and self is bumping up against the structures for the masses, and that is helping you to realize like more clearly who you are. And to create the brightest future possible for humanity, it takes individuals rising up within their own sovereignty. So, sovereignty is a big concept when it comes to Aquarius, as far as like Aquarius essentially, and maybe that's a great place to transition into more of a deep dive into Aquarius. So Aquarius is like a evolutionary aim. Again, this is like studying through Stephen Forrest's lens of evolutionary astrology, but Aquarius as an archetypal evolutionary aim is about the process of individuation. So, and I should say, Aquarius is actually ruled anciently by Saturn, modernly by Uranus. So before Uranus was discovered, Saturn was the ruler, and then Uranus came along, and then Uranus is the ruler. And I like Stephen Forrest's approach as far as like, if you really want to understand Aquarius, you need both of them. And it is, again, going back to, like, really a rebel or an individual, like, you don't know who that is. You can't possibly figure it out if you can't bump up against some stuff that isn't it, you know? So the structure, the rules, if you will, the expectations, like, they act as a mirror for us to get to see our individual selves more clearly, which is definitely more the Uranian side of Aquarius as far as, like, that path to individuation and living as the full, like, fully developed, fully allowed, authentic being that you were born to be. That's essentially, like, what that highest archetype of Aquarius is all about, is that you are living as your authentic self, which is to say, like, I was talking to somebody the other day about, like, they were wanting more authenticity in their life, and it really sent me down this rabbit hole of, like, you know, what is authenticity? I only think about and talk about this stuff all the time, and I'm still on a loop of, like, trying to figure out, like, really what is authenticity? And I think it's, like, losing track of time. It's your heart overflowing. It's feeling full of connection and love and energy flowing through you, and again, like, losing track of time. Like, that to me is how I know when I'm in my authenticity. When I can just settle in on the open road and go and, like, not worry about, like, there's nowhere else in the world I would rather be in this moment. I'm being authentic. And if I'm bored, if I'm, like, really not happy where I am, it's like I personally, in my practice, use that to tell me that there must be something about this that isn't an authentic fit with my true soul. And yet, at the same time, I wanna say just a little bit about that as far as, like, even when you go places that aren't a good fit with your authentic soul, you can still learn stuff there. You can still take in a lesson or 2 while you happen to be at this place, you know? We don't have to close ourselves off just because, like, yeah, this is a little boring, like, maybe there is still something that you can get out of it. A perfect example, I as part of my workaholicness, like, you know, dating back over the last decade slash my whole life, I when I became an entrepreneur, I also took on the responsibility of being on several, board of directors, and that was such, like, such a good, like, Saturn return type thing as far as, like, or Saturn retrograde type thing of, like, what responsibilities do you actually want, and what responsibilities are you being called to let go? So this morning was my last meeting of my last board position, and I don't think I'm gonna be on a board again, maybe ever in my whole life. So it was like I took on these responsibilities for reasons that were career oriented, like trying to prove it, trying to prove my value, trying to, like, you know, get involved and let that, like, do good things for my business. Like, my motives weren't right going into those board positions, and I took on this responsibility, and shocker, it wasn't a good fit. It wasn't a good time. And yet this morning in the meeting, I'm doing the thing where I'm like, "Okay, so nothing is completely boring. Like, if I wasn't supposed to be here right now, I wouldn't be here right now. So what piece of interest can I get out of this?" About that time, the guy who was talking, who is like a cattle rancher, it was a Department of Ag meeting, agriculture. And so he's a cattle rancher, and he's talking about his international work with different countries and how he's sold semen to countries, and he's sold, like, embryos to countries, and, like, he's made all these different connections through social media, and he was talking about his takeaways and his lessons learned, and one of the pieces that he said, I was like, "You can't make this shit up." Like, that's exactly the summary of how Saturn retrograde works in a natal chart, like, and you're over here talking about, like, semen and bulls and, like, international beef trade, and anyways, so he's talking about it like, one of the main things he's learned is that, you know, all he can do is invest in his own program and, you know, put himself out there as far as, like, here's my program and here's what I do, and understand that that program isn't gonna be the right fit for every single person that's out there, that maybe what they're looking for is somebody else's program, that somebody else is doing it the way that would work for them. But again, his point was like, that doesn't mean that you can't still learn from each other. And even if they can't replicate your system, maybe they can teach you something, you can teach them something. There's still an exchange that can happen, even if you're using two fundamentally different systems. And so basically, like, to let the people who like your program, like, work with them and establish those connections, and also don't hesitate to establish connections with people whose programs they couldn't possibly replicate your program. It just wouldn't work. Because his example was, like, he got invited to, Romania, I do believe he said, or Bulgaria, I forget, I'm sorry. No disrespect, but I don't remember which one he said, but somewhere, and basically, like, went through, "Here's my program, here's what I'm doing," and they told him, like, "This just wouldn't work in this, wherever we are," and ongoing, like, development of that relationship, that connection, and now they have commissioned him to write a training manual about his process and his program, because there is so much that they want to learn from and model it and adapt it into what will work for them. So they are still paying him to create a training manual over his program, even though they're not gonna use it. So again, it's like, that is how Saturn retrograde works. It's like, you know, you have to invest in your program, what works for you, and you can put your program out there to try to connect with other people whose program is aligned with yours, and no hard feelings if somebody's program isn't going to work for you. But again, that doesn't mean that you can't still swap ideas and swap information and do the thing where you take their ideas and their theories into your system and run it through your system and see if it feels resonant to you. Yeah, I was like, what are the chances of this guy, like, sitting here talking about cattle and whatnot, and he's over here, like, giving me an example about, like, how to interpret this astrology thing. So I think that's pretty cool. Um, the the process of individuation, like, Aquarius specifically, if you have heavy Aquarius energy in your chart, um, that there is a very good chance that you will be born into a very small box of, like, here's who you're allowed to be. This is like the cultural conditioning of, like, we expect you to do this and we have it all figured out and you just have to, like, do it, just carry out the plan. And that they have, like, there's really intense training about, like, be normal, and, like, a really deep conditioning about what is normal, AKA what is expected of you, what is normal behavior, what are we willing to tolerate in terms of the conditional love that we're offering to you. So, yeah, heavy Aquarius energy, like, basically you're guaranteed an upbringing like that, where they are trying to put you in the box. And then the whole point of the Aquarius evolutionary aim is to use that cultural conditioning to thread by thread by thread to unravel, like, who is who is the trained monkey that they taught me to be, and who is my soul that I was born to be? Like, where is the differentiation between these two? And sorting that all apart so that you can be true to your individual self, that is the path of Aquarius energy. So with that comes pressures of conformity. And this is basically what I'm saying about kind of the conditioning process, the early upbringing process. There are, you know, when we have fears of being our individual self, those didn't get there by accident. Those didn't, like, just randomly wind up being how we felt about things. Like, we got taught through our early upbringing, through our past lives, if you want to go there, um, that, like, conformity will save your life. That basically, like, in the grand tradition of human beings, that, like, the herd was safe. It was a safer place to be, and that the members of the herd that left to go out on their own, that they were more likely to succumb to the elements or predators or whatever else, so they weren't as likely to pass down their DNA, continue their lineage, and so the herd survived. And naturally, we as humans are a bit of a herd animal because of that. There's a safety in conformity, and so this Saturn in Aquarius period in general, like this 2.5 years that we have this energy with us, um, It's helping us to recognize, like, where are we being coerced or manipulated or pressured into being something that we're not, into being in this box that somebody else has decided that we should fit ourselves into. Um, there's also where we can become aware of how we may be projecting our fears onto other people. And by that, I mean, there's a big difference between a very general fear that if I reveal my authentic self, that I'll be judged, and thinking, like, if I reveal myself to Dolly, that she will judge me. Like, one is a general fear about myself, the other is actually a judgment about her. And it's like, so often, like, I know for me, I can make up fears like that where I'm afraid she won't understand or she won't get it or she'll be mad or she'll be hurt or whatever it is. And like that is me making up her side of the story, like projecting my fear onto her, using her potentially negative reaction to hold myself in place when that is a box that I am putting myself in. But again, we don't do this to ourselves for no reason. Like we have basically been trained through our upbringing that it works out better for you when you just conform with what we expect of you. And in the real world, there are really extreme versions of this being enforced in terms of Saturn representing like structure and laws to a certain extent. Um, imprisonment and being cut off financially, AKA like getting fired from your job or not being hireable, or like your parents supporting you and then cutting you off because you're not jumping through the hoops, or like that freaking, you gotta wonder if this is even real. There was a set of parents who are like suing their son for not giving them grandkids. Like, they're not cutting him off, they are asking him to pay the cost of raising him because he won't produce grandchildren. So essentially, like, we want our money back. We had you so that you could give us grandkids, and now you're not doing it, and we want our money back. So, like, retroactively cutting you off. Like, holy shit, how is that even a thing? Um, this is yeah. Ouch. Mm. So, another piece of Aquarius energy is that like on the shadow side of this archetype, one of the stereotypes that I hear often is that Aquarius is a cold energy, or if you have Aquarius placements, you get told that you're cold, emotionally cold or detached, something like that, aloof, maybe a loner. Um, and I love how Stephen Forrest puts this, where he calls it is emotional distance, yes, but it is traumatically induced emotional distance. So basically, Aquarius planets in your chart in general are pointing towards past life experiences where you experienced something that was too emotionally strong for your system to cope with. And through that experience of being emotionally overwhelmed, you developed the ability to essentially detach from your emotions as if they weren't even happening, and which allows them to bottle up in the background. I mean, no energy is immune to, like, you can't bottle any energy forever. Eventually, it will explode. It'll come out in destructive ways. Um, but this shadow of traumatically induced emotional distance, like, basically Aquarius energy is protective over the self, as far as, like, it's a skill to not be sucked under the undertow of your own emotions. Like, to have that ability to detach is something that most likely says there is a lot in your emotional self, in your emotional body, that has yet to be processed, and there's a real part of that Aquarius energy where that emotional coldness is actually a self-protective instinct, and that opening your heart and, like, shining your light out into the world, like, with Aquarius energy is actually something that takes a shit ton of courage because of, like, the past of like, how did you get to this Aquarius place to begin with? Basically, somebody's expectations wounded you deeply, like basically traumatized you. And this time with those Aquarius placements, you're here to actually find a way back into your own sovereignty, back into your own freedom to be the individual soul that you were born to be. And chances are, because of your past life history, the place you're born into is a small box that, like, you have the opportunity to come alive out of. Like, I think about Dolly, she's got 4 planets in Aquarius, and she was raised in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, yeah. So, like, just having a really strict example of what you're expected to be, what the rules are, and harsh punishments for stepping outside the rules. Like, I don't know how much you know about Jehovah's Witnesses, but there's disfellowship, which when Dolly was like, I don't even know, 9 or 10-ish, her dad was disfellowshipped by the witnesses, and her mom stayed in the church and continued taking the kids to church while the dad could no longer go because he had broken the rules and was no longer allowed to be there. And that whole thing, like, that was part of her waking up outside of the box. Like, she and I have talked many times about, like, I wonder if they hadn't disfellowshipped her dad, how long would she have stayed in the box? Because she wasn't resonating, she didn't like it, but the punishment for stepping outside the lines was that you couldn't talk to your family anymore. And she's like, "Well, I'm pretty sure I need my family, so I think I'm gonna just stay put." And then they disfellowshipped her dad, and now she's, like, got options. And it's like, you don't know how life is gonna provoke you to wake up out of that box that you get born into, but trust that it absolutely promises that. So that's Aquarius. Let's see. You guys are all up in the chat. I love it so much. I love going back through it. Exactly. I've had consistently karmic once they get it. So interesting. Exactly. I've consistently had karmic interactions with Aquarian men specifically. They want intimacy but withdraw once they get it. It is, yeah, it's like a real interesting push pull with Aquarius energy. And Dolly describes it as being on the island sometimes where there is nobody else in the world. She's on the island and she exists in a world all by herself. She is energetically disconnected from everyone. And again, it is traumatically induced emotional distance because it hurts too much to stay connected, is basically the idea. And of course, there are ways where, and this is what she's been doing the last few years, is like there are ways to build up our emotional coping skills so that we can stay connected more often for longer periods of time because we have better coping skills to process the emotions that those connections can spark. Basically, connecting with another human being is intense. It's like just wild, just super intense. So yeah, like it's definitely a push pull of like deeply wanting intimacy and connection and yet having your system be overwhelmed by it and needing to separate in order to like regain your balance so that then you can like reattach and try again and like it it's interesting. It takes on my part what it's built in me is more and more resilience around where I started as far as like, what are you taking responsibility for? What are you not taking responsibility for? And she has taught me I cannot be responsible for her emotions because I trigger her by accident, not all the time, but like often. Often. I say something that I even think is a compliment and she'll get triggered and go to the island and emotionally disconnect from me. And now I'm emotionally disconnected from. She withdraws her energy and now I have a hole where that energy was, and that was painful the first, couple dozen times it happened, and it was only here within the last week or so that it was the first time that, like, I was able to observe the entire thing without, like, taking it personally, basically. So it definitely is, like, I think whichever side you're on, um, if you're the Aquarius, like, getting triggered and disconnecting, or if you're the one who's trying to love and accidentally triggering and being disconnected from, like, there's a learning inside that for both people, I think. don't know what this is doing. It's like out of control today. Just put you back there. That's good. Oh my gosh. Who knows? This is day 2. Day 2 is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. Okay, there we go. Um, Saturn. Let's see. Ooh. My Aquarius house is the 4th, the IC, and Saturn is vacationing there at my IC. Yeah. Well, and I think that means, like, you yourself have, like, a little bit of a deep relationship with that Aquarius archetype, it being on your IC, a little bit of an unconscious relationship where probably I mean, I don't know this for sure, but when we attract people with our IC, it's like they usually show us a side of ourselves that is pretty tough to accept that like that's how we roll. And I think of this like, okay, so I'm a Cancer IC, I have a Capricorn midheaven. And when I attract people like heavy in their Cancer energy, especially when they're in their Cancer shadow, nothing will piss me off more. Nothing will annoy me faster than a Cancer shadow. And I think it's just because, like, that's my own shit coming to the surface and being reflected back to me. So, in that case, I mean, I don't know. You could consider if this works in your system as well. But, like, them emotionally detaching from you, like, kind of, like, getting into that intimacy and then pulling back, like, I wonder if there's something, like, in your own energy patterns that is, like, reflective of. But that's my own way of working with my IC energy. So Saturn specifically, I went through Saturn archetype in pretty good detail in that Saturn return story time that just came out on my channel. But I did want to hit some of the highlights here as far as like just looking back at your own personal Saturn. Saturn in our charts represents our maturation, our process of maturing. It shows where we are intended to take responsibility, and that these, like our personal Saturn, represents how we will be initiated through the various phases of our life. So, for example, your first Saturn return at age 29 and a half is how you're initiated from childhood into adulthood. And then the second one initiates you from adulthood into elderhood. Um, and so every 29 and a half years, as Saturn makes a full lap around, we each are moving on into the next phase of who we were born to be. Saturn represents the structures and the boundaries and the physicality, the building that you yourself intended to do. So Saturn is also closely related to time, and it's like your unique Saturn placement shows how you plan to build or invest your time on a daily basis. Um, and then also, because it's representing structure and boundaries and all of that, it also represents where we have to learn to say no. Because, we are finite beings. We are, in a plane of existence where there's time and that's finite and we only have this right now moment right now. And so basically, like, while you can do anything in the whole world, like the whole world's at your fingertips kind of thing, you really can't do anything. You have to pick something. And your Saturn sign is aiming to show, like, where did you intend to use your precious finite time and energy to build something that would let you feel at the end of your life like you didn't just climb a mountain, you climbed the mountain that your soul was born to climb. Also, Saturn, as a keyword for Saturn, is consequences. And consequences as a topic is neutral. So, rewards are consequences, and punishments are also consequences. And so at that, it's like the principles of cause and effect, basically, that when we look at Saturn, we can and this is like Saturn transits, I would say, is like when you have a Saturn transit, like for example, you know, Saturn in Aquarius is opposite my moon in Leo. So like that's a Saturn transit that's lasting for like a year by a loose orb. It's like a whole process. Um, but that this is going to bring cause and effect. This is going to bring like a magnifying glass or a mirror that I can look into, or some consequences that are going to help me see where I am in my development. And a phrase that I really love with Saturn, if you invest in your Saturn, Saturn invests in you. So I began my spiritual journey way back when by committing to daily self-care, and I had been doing that for like 5 years when I found my way to astrology, and that basically as I began understanding my Saturn placement, I was like, "Holy shit, like this is basically my morning time, my daily morning time that I committed to way back when I look at the activities that I do in that morning time every single day, that like I felt my way there. It was what my soul wanted to be doing, that felt like I was actually feeding myself." And then I started studying Saturn and Sagittarius in the ninth house, and it was like recommending all of these practices that basically I had started doing 4 or 5 years ago because I was, like, feeling that this is what I need to be doing to be taking really good care of myself, and turns out every ounce of that was me developing my Saturn. It was me investing my time each and every day into my unique Saturn placement. So I feel like that's like another piece of how astrology can work, which I absolutely love, is you really don't have to know this stuff to feel your way to the right place at the right time. Like you don't have to know that you're a Pisces North Node, Virgo South Node to know that like I am killing myself with my workaholic tendencies. I'm not going to live much longer if I can't find a different way. And then like I snapped into going with the flow and going with my own flow specifically because it felt so much better. And that was, again, years before I learned about a thing called a Pisces North Node. So I do think that your soul knows how to evolve. Like when you really turn inward and like listen to what's fun for you, what feels good, what feels expansive, what feels like you're losing track of time. You're like forgetting to check your phone. You're forgetting that the rest of the world exists because you're having so much fun in your right now moment. Like those things I think are possible when you really get into your unique Saturn vibration. It is going to ask for effort or work, but again, it's like when you invest that effort, it absolutely pays dividends and a return on the energy that you put into it. So Saturn also represents our inner sense of morality. So like defining for yourself your own like inner compass, your own conscience, your own sense of right and wrong in the world. And again, like if you have Saturn retrograde in your birth chart like I do, it's like somebody else was going to teach you their version of right and wrong and what they thought the rules are and that you should follow. And thanks to their rules, it was like you got to learn how not to do it. You know, like Saturn retrograde, like you get to see what's not working in the systems around you. And then you get to factor that feedback in when you build your own system. Like if you look at your parents and you see, like, wow, they worked their asses off and maybe they did achieve financial stability, but neither of them is happy, like, I don't get it. Like, you reached your goal and you're not happy. Like, what the fuck was the point of the goal? Like, that's okay, so I don't understand your reasoning there. I think I'm gonna have to go my own way. I think I'm gonna put happiness, like, closer to the top of the priority list and bump the physical security down just a little bit, like, at least so it's a little more balanced with the happiness. Like, so creating your own recipe of what is gonna be your way, your right way. And really, like and I go through this repeatedly in my Saturn return story time, but it's like Saturn transits are asking, "Who do you wanna be in this world? How do you use your daily life to move in this direction? Who do you wanna be in the world?" Not who were you trained to be, but who do you wanna be? And the thing is, like, that's where I kinda go back full circle to, like, between the Saturn retrograde that's like 5 months long and then the shadow that exists on, gosh, what would that even be? Like 3 months of either side of the Saturn retrograde. Like you add that up, that's like 11 months, a year that Saturn is either retrograde or in its shadow. So it's like 1 month, like 1 out of 12 people is here to just follow the cookie cutter way, you know? And I think that's maybe relatable. Like in my life, I feel like, you know, every once in a while you find like a diehard rule follower who just seems to like be getting off on following the rules and enforcing the rules. Like I had a health inspector like this one time. She was just all about it. And I'll bet you she was born in that like one little window of like totally direct Saturn where she's just here to enforce the status quo and she's having a good time doing it. And then you have the rest of the population where, almost half have it actually retrograde, almost half have it, in shadow in some form in their chart. So it's like most of us are here to make up our own way. So when you have Saturn in Aquarius, like basically that's the idea as far as like how can Saturn in Aquarius help you to like get deeper into your own Saturn energy, whatever sign that's in, whatever house that's in. Um, when we put our Saturn through Aquarius, we get to see the social conditioning that we have been subjected to. The box that we are operating inside of becomes clearer to us. And basically, like all of us, even if your Saturn isn't in Aquarius natally, all of us are having the opportunity to see these boxes and to step out of the boxes and to lean moment by moment, step by step, as much as we possibly can, in the direction of what does feel authentic for us personally, aka what does feel like it feeds our soul, it nourishes our being. We were born to do this piece or this activity or whatever it might be. So I think we all have a really really rich opportunity to get some perspective. And I'm going to talk more about this in Monday's episode of Astrology Energy, just because we don't have like a ton of stuff going on in the transits for this upcoming week, aside from Mercury will be re-entering Gemini, I believe on Sunday, like the 12th, maybe 12th or 13th. Gemini will be back in Mercury will be back in Gemini. Yeah, so some closing questions. Or no, that's what I was going to talk about in the astrology energy was like, we have Pluto retrograde right now, and Saturn is turning retrograde on June 4th. And then leading up to October 1st, we have 5 other planets going retrograde. Mercury will have another retrograde, Neptune goes retrograde, Chiron goes retrograde, and a couple others, and Jupiter, and I forget what else, but I'll go through this in more detail on Monday. And so leading up to October, we have all of this energy turning retrograde, and it feels like this opportunity to like really get clear on like who we are. Like retrograde is looking backwards, it's our hindsight, it's getting clear, it's reworking the situation, doubling back and like checking our work and checking our reasons why and deepening into, is this really the best thing for me? Is this the best possible path that I can imagine for myself? And if it's not, these 4 or 5 months leading up to October and really through the end of the year are about getting that clarity together for yourself. And then in October, we have Mercury stationing direct, and then Pluto, and then Saturn. November, there's a planet stationing direct. December, there's 2 planets stationing direct. So there are all of these points like October, November, December that are going to bring us steps forward that will be a direct reflection, a direct consequence of the work, the introspection, and the reflection that we are able to do for the rest of the summer and on into the fall until these planets are turning direct in October. So some closing questions to think about. Yes, Saturn retrograde, but also like all of these retrogrades that are coming. The first one is, how can you use your daily life, your time, to build the life you truly want? This is part of that taking responsibility for what is truly your responsibility. How can you use your daily life, your time, to build the life you truly want? Are there any status quos in your world that have outlived their usefulness? So, status quo, thinking along the lines of like, well, that's just the way it's always been. Nothing will piss me off faster. That is like one of my biggest pet peeves is when somebody says, well, because that's the way we've always done it. That is no reason to do anything. And so these retrogrades, especially the Saturn retrograde, is like to do specifically with the status quo, the existing structure, the existing framework that you have in place. Are there any any status quos in any relationships, in any hobby, in any work situation, in any living situation, anything and everything, any status quos that have outlived their usefulness. That's the kind of piece where let's say there's a friend that you're realizing, like, I give everything to this friend and I don't feel like I get anything in return. I feel like this relationship is an energy drain for me, so I'm going to restructure. I'm going to tell that friend that, I need to take some space for myself. Maybe you don't say anything at all. It's totally up to you. And with that empty space then that you've now created in your world because you let go of this energy draining situation that you had currently been participating in, you now have this open space in your grid. And when Saturn stations direct, when all of these other planets are stationing direct, it's that kind of open space that gets filled back up with whatever the next chapter of your evolution is that is unfolding. And the question I shared at the beginning, what new responsibilities are you feeling called to take within your life? And which responsibilities are you being called to release? And these are the kinds of things that, especially when we're in the fixed signs and like fixed signs aren't like super excited about change, um, we can feel a lot of things about changing patterns in our world where the patterns usually include other people. So, like, if I'm going to make a change that supports me living my authentic life, I'm sorry, but that automatically impacts you. Like if I'm going to decide that I want to go over here and do this, like I'm obviously not going to be over here anymore with whoever was over there with me. So the choices that we make naturally do impact other people. That's where like Aquarius is very intertwined with group dynamics. And that's where the shadow side of Aquarius is very much conforming into whatever group dynamics are present. Um, but in its highest frequency, we truly can turn inward and go within ourselves to find like what truly feels like the most authentic side of me, and then wave your little freak flag out in the world and let the people who are weird like you come. So you can like attract your own community, your own soul tribe, like that quote, like your vibe attracts your tribe. Like when you let go of the acquaintances or the friends of habit or the relationships that like that's just part of how it was. It was part of how I do it. Like that's my family. Of course I go over there every weekend. Like no, not of course. Like does it feed your soul? Like does that structure work for you? And this is not a time to necessarily like be burning bridges and telling everyone in the world to go f themselves. Like allow ourselves to become aware and like let that awareness permeate our being to let these realizations come to the surface. Like if you are, as we ask like which responsibilities are you being called to release, and this person naturally occurs to you and you're like, huh, that's interesting. You don't have to call that person up and explain how, like, I'm pretty sure I'm overly responsible towards you and I got to quit it and you got to get on your own 2 feet and get away from me. Like, nope, you could just let the realization sink in for a couple months that like, wow, like, when we're talking about over responsibility, I associated it with this person. That's really interesting. I'm gonna sleep on that a couple dozen times and see what comes out. And it's amazing how, that deep contemplation of just even becoming aware that, wow, there really is a change maybe that I would like to see in my life. Like we usually don't have to like actually enact that change. Usually the opportunity presents itself, like Saturn turns direct and all and the path opens to like here's a very natural unfolding of like that exact thing that you wanted happening. Sometimes we have to be direct about it, sometimes not. It really depends on the situation, but usually when things come up as a result of a retrograde planet and that you're dealing with like that going inward and reflecting and all of that, usually like the retrograde period in its entirety is meant for the reflection, and that once the planet stations direct, that there is a much clearer and easier path forward. And then I do have a tarot reading that goes along with this energy. that will be on the newsletter on Monday. So if you want to check that out, I do encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter where we list out the transits for the upcoming week. We give you a tarot energy reading, some links back to some videos from the channel that are related. Lots of good resources in there that I am like just one more outlet of like, I love participating with the transits and tracking like all of this energy in real time. So one more way of taking that energy and channeling it into like, here's a little snapshot of kind of where we currently are as we build in this eternal ongoing evolution. Um, Let us see. I think you guys got a lot in the chat. I am good to hang out for a moment. And yeah, so I'm going to see what you got here. Ooh, interesting. I'm going to come back to that. Wouldn't the status quo potentially be upended by Pluto return? Yes. And that's another another signification of all of these retrogrades that are happening right now. So, like, Saturn retrograde isn't happening in a vacuum, it's happening at the same time as Pluto retrograde. And Pluto is going retrograde over the spot where the US Pluto return exacted earlier this year in February. So, I think it's like in July that it'll go retrograde over 27 degrees. And then it's later in the year, maybe December, where it'll go back over 27 degrees. And then it goes on into Aquarius like March, I think, of 2023. Um, and so that process is also unfolding in the background. So that's huge for, like I talk about in my US Pluto return video, it's huge for the US, of course, but because of our global interconnected economy, it's really huge for the entire world that the US is going through such a radical transformative period. Um, and that Saturn retrograde is going on at the same time. So this Pluto retrograde is bringing all of this like corruption and toxicity and nasty ass crap that's been going on behind the scenes for decades, centuries, millennia, whatever. And it's bringing it to the surface so that we can all see it. Meanwhile, Saturn retrograde doing its thing where we are becoming aware of how have I been manipulated into being who I thought I was supposed to be, how, marketing is one of those things where like we all like, you can't escape marketing. You can't escape the news. Like it finds you. You go to eat at the Indian restaurant and they got freaking CNN playing over there. You're like, try not to watch the news. And yet it'll find you if it's really meant to. And so all of these different sources of information that have their own agenda, like those agendas are being brought to the light of day by the Pluto retrograde that's going on, and especially the fact that it's happening right on top of the Pluto return point for the US, and that those agendas coming to light, like I thought that this organization was neutral, and now I see that they're not. And because I see that they're so biased, it lets me see, like, oh my gosh, yes, it absolutely created bias inside of me, that like I was operating under bad information. And now I understand more, and it lets me see the previous restraints I had or the constraints around my beliefs, and it lets me move beyond them. So, like, they absolutely do work together. And that's why it's so interesting that, yeah, leading up to October, we will have 7 planets retrograde at the same time. Like, by the time they all get going, I can't even imagine. Like I said, like, I was born with 6 retrograde planets, and it's a shit show. It's like, it's a messed up, chaotic, crazy, so much to invent, so much to figure out about like who even am I? What even am I? So yeah, the rest of, like the next 4 or 5 months gonna be a little bit of a soul searching mission, I have a feeling. So I mean, I'm just super grateful that I have this outlet to process like my own following of the energy and share whatever it is that I'm seeing as far as like however that is helpful for anybody else. Let us see. I'm Cancer, Leo, Aquarius. How is Pluto blowing up my world? Be interested to know what degrees your Cancer placement is at, because Pluto in Capricorn is opposite Cancer. So that's one. Um, mm, Yeah, that's the main one. But again, like, it really does, like, take the whole chart to understand because Pluto in Capricorn, for example, is like it's squaring the other cardinal signs. So the cardinal signs are Aries, Libra, and then it's opposing Cancer. Um, Pluto in Capricorn is trining the earth signs, so Virgo placements and Taurus placements. It's sextiling water signs. Like there's a lot that could be happening between Pluto at the end of Capricorn and lots of different things in your chart. Would having Saturn retrograde conjunct Uranus retrograde be a kind of Aquarian energy? And this is a placement that I have. I have them both at 29 degrees Sagittarius, both retrograde. And I think so. I also, though, have it opposite my sun, like less than a degree away. And so, especially Uranus opposite the sun is like giving an Aquarian vibe. So I can't say for sure if it's that that makes it Uranian or if it's this. But it does seem really interesting that like Saturn and Uranus are the co-rulers of Aquarius. And so to have them both retrograde, both together, it's like your work and your path of individuality are basically one and the same, is how I interpret it, which makes a lot of sense for me as far as like this whole owning authenticity YouTube channel that I do is really just my own spiritual path. And then I share, here's what's, here's what's going on. And that does lead to work. So it is interesting how, yeah, I do think that there's definitely Aquarian vibes to those two being conjunct, period. Um, and the fact that they're both retrograde, meaning you will invent your own path to individuality and you will invent your own path of work through the world. Do I mean 7 retrograde planets all at once? Yes. So, like, right at the end of September, there will be 7 retrograde planets all at the same time. And it's October 1st, I do believe, when Mercury will station direct. And then October 8th, when Pluto stations direct. October 22nd, when Saturn stations direct. November 23rd, when Jupiter stations direct. December 3rd, Neptune stations direct. December 22nd, Chiron stations direct. At the end of October, Mars will turn retrograde. So October 30th through 2023, Mars will be retrograde in Gemini. And then also Uranus will be retrograde at that time in October, but will be retrograde until 2023. That'll go on into next year. So yeah, at the end of this year, we have 6 planets stationing direct. So that is it's gonna, like I said, it's gonna make for a really interesting rest of the year as far as the soul searching and the kind of title or tagline that I have for Astrology Energy on Monday is that these are gifted opportunities to claim yourself. These retrogrades are opportunities to see clearly what have I soaked up from the outside world that I've been doing that has just become normal and the status quo, and how can I move more in harmony with what I'm feeling to be true for me on the inside. So retrogrades, like they may feel like slowdowns or like maybe things are bumpy or whatever, but really it is an opportunity to figure out what in your life is a reflection of your authentic soul and what in your life have you hung on yourself because that was what was previously expected. So an opportunity to clear out some space from your grid. And as those planets station direct later in the year, that's bringing more of those new pieces and like how moving forward with all of this and all of them things. So Saturn opposite midheaven. I would be interested to know if it was on the 3rd house side or the 4th. And I would be interested to know what sign rules your midheaven and if that planet that rules your midheaven is making any aspects to your Saturn. Yeah. basically what it means is that, like, it's gonna feel like, okay, so to practice my midheaven, I need to do this, and to practice my Saturn, I need to do this, and, like, wait, how do I do both of those things? Well, like, basically, the bottom line is that at one given time, you can really only do one or the other, but that by regularly doing this one and regularly doing this one at different times, making a point to engage both of those energies, eventually through oppositions, they actually end up being some of your strongest gifts that you have, I believe, because you are taking a pair of sister signs, usually. Um, Oppositions can be kind of on the cusp to where maybe you have like an opposition that strays out of bounds of like being in a set of sister signs. But like, for example, Aries and Libra, Taurus and Scorpio, the ones that are across from each other. So you have like both of these that when you develop one, it balances the other. And when you develop this one, it balances the other. So by doing, in your case, by doing your midheaven, you are balancing your Saturn. And by doing your Saturn, you're balancing your midheaven. So there can be chaos and anxiety because it feels like you're being moved in two different directions. But if you can let it be more simple and just accept that, like, either I'm going to do this one right now or I'm going to do this one right now. And the more I practice one, the better my other one's going to be. And you just kind of go back in this perpetual state of essentially harnessing the best of what both of them have to offer. So that's really general, like not knowing the rest of the pieces on your chart. Very similar, I would say, to thoughts on Saturn square ascendant crooked trail, to what I just talked about with the opposition. Oppositions and squares work a lot the same. The difference with the square is that it's obviously not happening in a set of sister signs. It's happening in signs of the same modality. Usually, again, you can be on the cusp of a sign and get off a little bit in that. But for example, like you would have the fixed signs squaring each other. So like if you had an Aquarius rising, you could square Taurus and you could square Scorpio. So those squares, it's like, again, your goal eventually is to harness the best of both of them. It's also to understand like why don't they get along? Like why is there a conflict between Taurus and Leo, for example? Like I have my moon at Leo and my moon at 24 Leo and Jupiter at 23 Taurus. So they are like almost exactly square. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about that one, like the Taurus Leo square. And so you can kind of like get into, well, they have different agendas. They have a very different set of priorities. And yet they do still have a lot in common. But basically, the trick with any hard aspects, I think, is to find a way to find both of them, locate both energies inside yourself, and then cultivate both of them on purpose and watch how one getting stronger actually helps the other get stronger. Saturn at 22 degrees of Aries, 10th house, near my midheaven and north node. Holy shit. Are your midheaven and north node in Aries also? Come back to that one. And this one's Saturn 16 degrees Scorpio, right on the ascendant, 12th house to the first. I'm going to assume you mean the Saturn is on the 12th house side. But again, that's a really, really it's a really intentional placement when you land things on your ascendant or on your midheaven, because those are the houses, the house lines that are dividing up your chart. Those are what are moving like every couple minutes, like that's moving. So I think it's like one rising sign, it takes like, what is it, like an hour and a half? I don't know off the top of my head. It's really short, like an hour and a half to get through one rising sign, and then you're on into the next one. So when you think about timing your birth, if you want something on your ascendant, you have like a 5 to 10 minute window of like landing it within a degree or two of like that degree where your ascendant landed. So yeah, like that always feels like a really good starting point when I see something that's like exactly on the ascendant or exactly on the midheaven. Um, and then also, oh no, that was the example before. But yeah, Saturn on the ascendant, you're going to, any planets on the ascendant, you're going to embody that planet more so if it's on the first house side, more unconsciously if it's on the 12th house side. Um, but yeah, especially Saturn on the ascendant, like leading with this mind that just structures things, and especially where it's Scorpio, and Scorpio is very compartmentalized already. Then you have Saturn in Scorpio, which is like extra, a little extra compartmentalization going on there. Um, let's see. I think I've read most of what was up here. You gotta love that. That's funny. Something about, yeah. You never know. You step away for a second, you never know what topics I'm gonna get into. Yeah, October looks like it's going to be a very, interesting turning point. Also, um, so like the Jupiter retrograde, which will be stationing direct on November 23rd, by that point, it'll be back into Pisces because during October, Jupiter is gonna come out of Aries and go back to Pisces for a couple months, and then in December, like right at the end of December, I think, it comes back into Aries for like its full pass. So October will see multiple planets stationing direct. It will also see um, Jupiter regressing back into Pisces for like its last couple months of that transit. So yeah, October is definitely got something um, something of an expansion, I guess I want to say, in store for us. And like what exactly that is and what magnitude it will hold. I mean, I think there's a lot of retrogrades going on that, I mean, it feels very Uranian to me. Like it's like kind of the nature of unpredictability. Like I think it'll just be the 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 depth and quality that we are able to sit with what is coming up for us in these next 4 or 5 months will basically be like coming full circle and will be shown to us in the physical, the depth of work that we did through the manifestations that come October, November, December, especially Jupiter going back into Pisces. Like there's mad blessings possible with that surge of energy, at least in my experience. So I do think that there are big things coming at the end of this year, and yet I also think that the real takeoff is more like at the end of December when Jupiter comes back into Aries after its final retreat back into Pisces. Like there's some kind of double checking, double making sure, like realigning, like, yeah, okay, we've gotten some pieces of what I want to do in the future, that Jupiter and Aries vision and charging forward. But first, I'm going to go back into Pisces and double check that this is actually in alignment with unconditional love, actually in alignment with what's in the highest good of the all. And then I'm going to like really move forward after I've grounded it back into spirituality like one more time. So big things happening like all the rest of this year. But yeah, it's definitely fun to follow all of the different transits of energy. It kind of feels like this year has felt like we stand still and then we get to run forward for just a second and then we have to stop again. Like um that game that I played when I was little, like green light, red light or whatever, like they would yell green light and you got to like run real fast and then they yell red light and you got to stop. And the first person to get over the line like wins. But if you keep going when they yell red light, like then you're out. And this year has felt like you get little pockets of like green light, red light, and like immediately stop. So yeah, there's been a lot of start and stop this year. And I think that's kind of like it's like a game planning year. Like we're in kind of a home stretch leading up to 2027, which is this whole like astrology energy of 2027 is really fun. If you want to look, there's already lots of videos out there about that. But this is like 2022 feels like we're going back to the drawing board a little bit and really getting clear about our why and our what and our who and our how. And more than ever before, it's going to be tailor made to ourselves. And it just feels like a year of kind of like accelerated deconditioning almost of like getting all of the things that aren't ours out of the equation so that we can make really authentic choices once we have only left in the equation like what's truly ours. That's interesting. So Shay says sometimes planets on the ascendant can affect the birth itself. For example, Saturn on the ascendant can indicate that the birth was delayed or that there were complications. So that's really interesting. I'm going to take that one too, Shay, and ponder, um, because that is interesting from the standpoint of like the birth that we manifest is really like our initial trauma into this life. Like I personally have come to work with the idea of trauma as in we are all traumatized. Like in terms of the very first trauma is when you come out of your mother and they cut the umbilical cord and you're on your own. It's the traumatizing. And so like basically birth in and of itself is traumatic. And there are some people who have worse births than others, and that really like birth is symbolic of the path that you're coming for in general. So, like, for example, I was watching this documentary about Nancy Spungen and Sid. They were a couple, like, back in the '70s punk rock scene, like, helped build it and make it what it was, like, Sid was part of the Sex Pistols and on and on. Anyways, Nancy was just, like, a deeply troubled individual, like, so many emotional issues in a time when that sort of thing just, like, was not understood, and when she was born, she had the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, and that she was, like, low on oxygen or whatever, and that caused problems and forced her to be in the NICU for several couple weeks, I think, where like her parents weren't allowed to hold her for the first several weeks of her life, and that just set her up for like these attachment issues and on and on and on. And she has Chiron in the 12th house, and it's like, I mean, that one isn't so much, like, close to her ascendant, but it is in the same sign as her ascendant, so, like, it is in the 12th house, kinda far away, but they're both in Aquarius, like, she's an Aquarius rising and an Aquarius Chiron, and she had, like, a super traumatic entry into the world, but, I mean, like, that was only symbolic of, like, what the entire lifespan of her would be, and she was extremely, intuitive and had I take that back. I think she was like a Pisces rising. I don't know. I'll have to double check. But extremely intuitive and like always knew that she wouldn't live past her 21st birthday or whatever. And so she did only live 20 years, and that like the entire time, like when you listen to her upbringing, like basically the entire thing was extremely painful, and that the birth being so traumatic and so difficult was really just a metaphor for like what her entire life was going to be. And so I feel like when you have like a really like harmonious setup with your ascendant, like yes, you may have a less difficult birth into the world. That doesn't mean that your life is going to be free of challenges or that birth still isn't traumatic. But there are absolutely planets that we can look for in conjunction with the ascendant descendant axis that can indicate that there's something going on. And I think like it's really interesting like how many different ways your birth can be messed with by outside people. um, like in my birth story, they told my mom that like I wasn't coming fast enough, and that if she didn't push harder and like get me out faster, they were going to have to go get the forceps, like those little tongy things, and like pull me out of there. And my mom was like freaked the hell out. Was like, "You are not putting forceps in there on my baby's head. Like I'll push harder." And they forced me out of there, even though like I wasn't coming. And like then another person's story that she was telling me was like kind of the opposite. Like the doctor wasn't there, and so like the baby is coming and a nurse is like holding the baby in, like forcing the baby to stay until the doctor can come. Like why would you even do that? Like now that I think about it, like that doesn't even make sense. Like if the baby's coming out, like let it pop on out. I don't know, maybe there was something else going on that I'm missing. But it's like any time that like our timing is interfered with by other people, like that sets up a trauma that I think like it takes your whole life to try to like bring some awareness back around like how to be comfortable inside your own vessel, inside your own instincts and your own sense of timing and all of that. So Yeah, our birth, our entrance into life is deeply fascinating for a number of reasons. Mm, yeah. Mm. Yeah, as far as, like, a difficult birth, I would look for, like, malefic type planets in either your 1st house or your 12th house. Um, that being said, like, any kind of planets in the angular houses, like 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th, um, I think those yeah, they indicate just a tougher ride through the world when you have planets connected to the AC/DC, IC/MC points or signs in your chart, that there's just kind of like a more dominant saturation, if you will, to those lessons, like throughout more like prevalent in more areas of your life. Like, for example, like if you have something in the 10th house, like automatically, like it affects your 4th house. I automatically brings in your ACDC, just because like that intersect those two crosses or those two axes. Um, that like when you activate one of those 4 points, like it kind of automatically brings online all 4 of those aspects. So yeah, our chart, like the way that it's all interconnected and um like, can you trigger one piece of it, and that brings, like, a whole it lights up a whole bunch of pieces, like, I freaking love astrology. Freaking love astrology. Let's see. Wow, heavy aspects in Virgo, Libra at IC. So, anytime you have, like, a cluster of anything around your IC, like, that energy is deeply internal, and like that IC point is said to be like under the earth, like it's not visible, it's like deeply hidden away, it's very private. um when you have heavy energy at the bottom of your chart like that, I think it leads to like more introverted tendencies versus like if you have a whole range of like planets at the top half of your chart, I think that definitely like lends your energy more often to being extroverted. And if you have kind of a mixture, both of them, then you're going to lean towards the more middle of like, I can be out in the world and extrovert if I need to. I also really enjoy some alone time when I get the chance, or I try to do that every day or whatever. um, so yeah, I think like when you have a cluster of energy around your IC, like that is begging for like an extra helping of solitude, an extra helping of sleep, and where your emotions have more access to you, essentially. But that's just kind of how I think about it, and that's not really pulling in the Virgo Libra pieces. Um, but I think regardless of the sign, like when we're talking about the IC, like usually that's way too private to just be showing to anybody and everybody. So like you're gonna have to get into a really safe space in order to explore those energies. I just found out the nurses told my mother to close her legs to prevent me from coming out, as there was a bunch of other ladies giving birth just as my mom was birthing me. So did she? Like, was she able to hold you in there? Like, it just doesn't even sound possible. Like, little baby, like, come on out. I don't yeah. God, more introverted now. So that's really interesting. Was extroverted years ago and more introverted now. Makes me think about your progressions, um, because that can be something where, like, for example, uh, last April 2021, my progressed moon, which your progressed moon changes sign every 2.5 years. My progressed moon moved from Libra to Scorpio. And I swear I felt it like downshifting from fifth gear to second. Like it was like, oh, ramping up the RPMs. Um, it was like, get the fuck away from society, like right now. That was also, yeah. There were some other things coinciding with that transit, but that was the main one of, like, when I had that progression, like, my moon moving into a sign that is, like, deeply internal and in their own feelings and needs a lot of space and time for their inner processes, like, it I'm an introverted person, and this took it to, like, a whole nother level. Same thing, in August of 2021, my progressed sun moved from Cancer to Leo, and your progressed sun stays in a sign for 30 years. So this is a way longer transit of, like, I had that progressed sun in Cancer for basically most of my whole life, and now with it in Leo, like, I mean, I basically record something, like, every single day, and I don't see a whole lot of people. Like, I don't necessarily consider Leo to automatically be an extroverted energy because it's more creative energy and being in your creative process and letting your light shine out into the world. So for me, that still tends to be a pretty introverted activity because I choose to engage like this. But if I did have more, like, I'm interested to see here in like a year and a half or so when my progressed moon leaves Scorpio and enters Sagittarius. So then I'll have 2.5 years of progressed Leo sun and progressed Sagittarius moon. Fire, fire. Like, I'm really excited to see what that looks like. Because I would imagine that that's going to make the Leo side like more extroverted. So we go through these cycles in our lives where sometimes we manifest, seasons that are like where we have to be a lone traveler. Like, there isn't room for more than one person on this journey. It's a journey you're gonna take all by yourself. Or sometimes, like, there are journeys that require other people to attend with you. So, regardless of which one you're in, there's always something to that's working its way out through that energy. Let's see. Saturn at 28 and Pluto at 26, conjunction 12th house Libra as a 12-degree Scorpio rising. That brought a long light to those placements. That is amazing news. So happy to hear that. Um, I think when you really go looking for like what are critical degrees, there are theories out there. The anaretic degrees, like what I was talking about, are 0 and 29. Um, but there are lots of other theories on degrees that are significant or that tell you certain things. And sometimes, like I said, like I take a theory and I run it through my birth chart and I'm like, does that make sense for me? And yes or no, I adopt it accordingly. Um, when I start stepping into like looking at those other degrees, like, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. So I think you could probably do some Googling around like what are the critical degree points in the zodiac signs and go from there as far as seeing if it makes sense for you or not. One of my mother's friends did that when I was very young. She was considered older, having a baby, closed her legs in hypersuit to the hospital, and sadly, the baby didn't make it due to this. Oh, that's so sad. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Mm. Birth, man, it's traumatic. Used to be like the leading cause of death for women was childbirth. Like that just, you know, not just traumatic on the one being born, like holy moly. Hey Vola, what's up? Chiron on ascendant is focal point of T square with Pluto, Saturn, MC. Oh my gosh, Connie. Whoa. Chiron on ascendant as a focal point of a T square with Pluto, Saturn, midheaven. Pluto, Saturn, midheaven. Pluto, Saturn, midheaven. Fuck. That's heavy. And Sun, Mercury, Mars, I see. Wow. What sign is rising in your midheaven? AKA, what I really want to know is like that square if you're ACDC, MCIC, like what modality is it? Not that that makes that any easier or less easy, but holy shit. I would imagine if it's mutable, at least that's a little bit easier, but dang. fixed would, gosh, I don't know which one would be harder, fixed or cardinal. Gosh, both would be really hard in their own ways. Leo, midheaven, Scorpio, ascendant, so fixed. So yeah, I don't know. So Leo, let's see, Scorpio ascendant. So that means you have a Chiron in Scorpio. That's interesting. And then Leo, Pluto, Saturn, midheaven. I don't mean to be like telling on your age or anything, but does that mean you were born like in the 50s? Does that sound right? Late 40s, early 50s, maybe? Yeah. Wow, that's a tough configuration. That's got like pretty much all the malefics included and it being like connected with your ascendant and midheaven. Um, like that's your way of going out into the world. So it's like anytime I go out in the world, like we're activating this big giant chunk of energy. Um, and then also like the sun being included, like that's kind of similar to how I feel about my sun conjunct Chiron. It's like for me to share my gifts is activating like a whole way bigger chunk of energy than just like what my sun, like the light that my sun wants me to shine in the world. Like I'm negotiating way more than just what my sun wants. It's like turning on a whole big thing. So yeah, that's a lot. That's a big old chunk of energy you got there. You guys, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for all of your questions. And ooh, Connie, please tell me more what you mean by that. I had maybe over ambitious pre-birth plan. Very curious about what that means. I do thank you for your time hanging out with me, catching this discussion of Saturn retrograde in Aquarius. Such a beautiful opportunity for us all to claim our true selves just a little bit more in this world. I am going to wrap it up there, but I do hope that you all take such good care of yourselves, and I will be seeing you soon. Okay, bye.